The War of 1812. President Madison drifts towards war in the election of 1808. President James Madison was elected and then inaugurated in March of 1809. He's part of what is known as the Virginia dynasty. He is the third in line of four presidents to come from the state of Virginia between 1789 and 1829. So Madison served after Washington and Jefferson, but before Monroe, all four of them being from Virginia. Mr. Madison was strongly Jeffersonian in his views, and he would lead the country into the War of 1812. Macon's Bill No. 2. It is adopted by Congress in 1810 to replace the Non-Intercourse Act of 1809. Now, the Non-Intercourse Act of 1809, which was passed at the end of Jefferson's presidency, would expire within a year, and it had proclaimed that the U.S. would trade with all other nations except for Britain and France. So the purpose of Macon's bill was to entice Britain or France to repeal commercial restrictions. And then the U.S. would restore non-importation against the non-repealing nation. In other words, whichever nation was willing to repeal commercial restrictions on the U.S. would then trade exclusively with them and cut out the other side. So Napoleon sees this as an opportunity for France, and Napoleon seizes on this opportunity with hopes of getting the U.S. in a war with Britain. So in August of 1810, he announces that the French decrees have been repealed. The French are going to open up trade with the United States. Madison believed he had no other choice but to accept Napoleon's gesture and gave the British 3 months to follow suit, or the U.S. would restore non-importation. Britain, angered, and demanded that the U.S. withdraw restrictions on Britain until France had withdrawn all of their restrictions on American shipping. All of this leads to increased tensions between the United States and Britain, and really Napoleon had no real intention of honoring the agreement to begin with. His sole purpose was to try and get the U.S. and Britain involved in military conflict. The War Hawks. So the 12th Congress of the United States met late in 1811, and it was deeply divided, although Republicans still held control. The 12th Congress differed from past Congresses. New, young leaders from the South and the West were strongly nationalistic, and they wanted war with Britain to achieve the glory that their fathers had had in the American Revolution. So these young war hawks were agitating for war with Britain. Henry Clay from Kentucky was elected the Speaker of the House. John C. Calhoun, elected as a representative of South Carolina. Both of these men will become extremely important in American history. The Battle of Tippecanoe. Western war hawks were eager to wipe out renewed Indian resistance against white settlers in the western wilderness. And two Shawnee twin brothers, Tecumseh and the Prophet, had organized a confederacy of all the tribes east of the Mississippi. Tecumseh and his brother posed a real threat to western expansion of America. Tecumseh was a noted warrior and perhaps one of the most gifted organizers of Native Americans in U.S. history. He believed in fairness between tribes, settling disputes about purchasing and selling land, and the Americans also thought that the British were aiding Tecumseh and his brother. So General William Henry Harrison, who will later go on to be president for a short period of time, advances with 1,000 men on the Indian headquarters, attempting to capture or kill Tecumseh. They're able to repel a surprise attack at Tippecanoe, which is in present-day Indiana, on November 1811. They torched the settlement at Tippecanoe. And the significance is it essentially ends the Indian threat. There's a formal agreement signed. It further spurs westward expansion. Indians are pushed further west. And it further whips up these war hawks in Congress. So the Warhawks, after getting rid of the Native American threat at the Battle of Tippecanoe, desired a U.S. attack on Canada to remove further Indian threats. And Canada was seen as vulnerable to attack as Britain was preoccupied with Napoleon and France. Also, Southern expansionists in Congress desired Spanish Florida, and Spain was Britain's ally. Further, the Warhawks were outraged by continued British impressment and orders in council. The impressment of U.S. sailors and the British policy of capturing U.S. ships had prevented agricultural products from being delivered to Europe, interacting or hurting American trade. So there's financial reasons for the Warhawks. There's also expansionist reasons for the Warhawks, and these young, hawkish members of Congress are pushing and agitating for war with Britain. Daniel Webster is a Federalist from New Hampshire. He spoke against entry into the war, so he was a dove, anti-hawkish. He spoke eloquently on behalf of New England manufacturing interests. Webster had ghostwritten many of John Marshall's opinions for the Supreme Court. Despite Webster's best efforts, he's unable to keep the influence of the Warhawks in Congress from driving us into war. So the U.S. declares war on Britain in June of 1812, and representatives from pro-British New England as well as the Middle Atlantic opposed the war. It was those from the South and the West that were for war. So why did the U.S. fight Britain when France had committed nearly as many maritime offenses? France had impressed U.S. sailors, captured U.S. ships, yet we choose to go to war with Britain and not with France. Now, there's different reasons. Part of it is the traditional Republican partiality towards France. Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans had always favored France over Britain. There is also the visibility of British impressments and of arming Native Americans. It was just more widely known by the American people that the British were behind things like this. The Chesapeake and Lefferts affair also tied in to the visibility. And finally, the lure of British Canada for timber, fishing, and pelts. So again, economic drive. Resentful New Englanders were hurt by the U.S. war effort. They believed British actions were old and exaggerated wrongs. Most of them still disliked France. New England merchants were still making handsome profits before the war, so despite British naval policies, New England merchants were still able to make profits. They opposed the acquisition of Canada, which would add more agrarian states, more farming states. New England investors probably lent more money to Britain than the U.S., so they're going to war with a country that owes them money. And New England farmers sent huge quantities of supplies and foodstuffs to Canada, helping Britain. And New England governors refused to permit their militias to serve outside of the states. So the War of 1812, an overview, it's a small war in the grand scheme of things. About 6,000 Americans are killed or wounded, mostly fought between Canadians and Americans. Very few British are actually involved in the fighting. It was probably one of America's most poorly fought wars on land. The nation was militarily unprepared for war. The attack on Canada ends in complete failure. Washington, D.C. is burned by the British. During the sack of Washington, D.C., the White House is burnt. At the time, it wasn't called the White House. It becomes the White House after the War of 1812 because to cover the smoke damage caused by the fire, they had to paint the exterior white. So before it was gray, then it becomes the White House. The British nearly won large territories in the New York and New England regions. There's also national disunity. The Federalists undermined the war effort throughout the war. Most of the American victories came as a result of the American Navy. So the U.S. Navy outperformed the Royal Navy on the Great Lakes.